I mean, the person's name isn't there, so
Well, I mean, it's Jake. We all know it's Jake. Anyway, Jake was
no.
asking, apparently said this to you, Ray. He said, "No, I believe in the early church. I just don't believe Luke's interpretation is as absolute as he thinks it is. He's forgetting the most basic thing. Ignatius says to submit to the bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Also, outside the church there is no salvation," from Cyprian in his first treatise on the unity of the church. So he's quoting Cyprian saying, outside of the church there is no salvation. And he says, no forgiveness of sins outside valid priests, no baptism, etc. And he says this multiple times. Do you guys want me to respond to all of this tonight? This will take a little while, but I can. I'll try to rush through it, I suppose.
I mean,
I'm
you
in
could,
for it, man.
but
I do want to hear your
I
explanation
would
on that.
like to hear the answer.
Luke, haven't you said before that there are no valid bishops anyway?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
So that just
But
refutes his
that's
point.
but that's Jake, and that's why Jake thinks there has to be seal because Ignatius says that you can't perform certain of these things outside of the church, and there's no salvation in the church.
Let's address each part of it though. Let's go through it in a very orderly way. We're prepared to answer these objections, guys. Even though there's so much more to study about these things. There is such a depth to the heresy and the evil of the post-Nicene church, especially as the centuries go on, because they get so much worse with each passing century. And in the 300s, they're not nearly as bad as they are in the 600s or 700s. They just get progressively worse. So he says, I believe in the early church. I think Jake is speaking for all Catholics and Orthodox when he talks like this. Oh, I believe in the early church. But in reality, we're not the only ones drawing a line at Nicaea. We're not the only ones saying there's a big difference between the pre-Nicene and the post-Nicene church. The Catholics and Orthodox know that. They know that there's a massive difference in the doctrine. But what they believe, kind of like how the liberals view the U.S. Constitution, they believe that the church is this living organism that can change over time, and not in a really organic way like the human body grows, and just becomes stronger and its existing parts become more developed and robust. But they believe limbs can be lopped off and that new things can be grafted in that are part of some other person or some other species, like an animal or something. It can just be like sewed onto a human body and become part of it. And that's the analogy that Vincent of Lerins made, that heretics will take heresies and try to graft them into the church. And they're not really just providing more proof and bringing these same doctrines to greater maturity with more exposition and more explanation of the same doctrine, but rather they're contradicting existing doctrines. They're reversing very dogmatic positions. So when he says, "Oh, I believe in the early church," he's lying, and so are the Catholics and Orthodox. They do not believe in the early church. They believe that the post-Nicene church, and just whatever the current church says, has the authority to override what the church taught from the beginning. And they'll play this game of having some kind of respect for the early church, but they don't respect the early church. The reality is, if the post-Nicene met the pre-Nicene church, the post-Nicene church would be excommunicated. That would be even after Nicaea. But how much more once you get to the time of the Mary worship, the icon worship, the papacy, the war, and now this all-out endorsement of divorce and remarriage, all the women dressing immodestly, all the parents sending their children to public school, they would all be excommunicated. So that's why I say to this first sentence, he believes in the early church. It's not true. They have overridden the early church, and they refuse to acknowledge the reality that if the pre-Nicene church met the post-Nicene bishops, they'd say, you're not even validly ordained bishops. And he says, I don't believe Luke's interpretation is as absolute as he thinks. Okay, guys, there's this game that Catholics and Orthodox love to play. It's kind of like in a video game when you meet a boss, and then you defeat the boss, and then the boss transforms, and the health bar grows back, and you have to fight him a second time, and now he's different. They have a phrase for it, shifting the goalpost. So if you go to any Catholic or Orthodox, the first thing they'll say is, well, I don't think you really understand what the church fathers are saying. I think you're taking them out of context, or I think that maybe just some of those bishops said that. Maybe that'll be like the second goalpost they go to. But at first they'll say you misunderstand them. Then when you show them, no, this is what the church fathers say, they'll say, well, that was just a couple of them. That was his personal opinion. Then when you show them that all of the church fathers say that, they say, well, they were all universally wrong. And that's the final boss. That's the one you just need to get them to that point as fast as possible, where you just show them all the quotes and they'll say, okay, the church was universally wrong on that. Because that's the final argument that they'll make. This one that he's pretending to make here, where he says, I don't think Luke's interpretation is as absolute as he thinks. That's just playing games. That's assuming that you're ignorant and you haven't actually read what the church says. But the church teaches the same doctrine all over the place about what unity is, that orthodoxy can't change over time. The faith was once for all handed down to the saints. It cannot change over the centuries or reverse. And later bishops do not have the authority to override earlier bishops. Who has the most authority, guys? An earlier bishop or a later bishop? Who has the most authority?
The one that came first.
I mean, it's just obvious. And yet they actually have the gall to say the later bishops have the authority to override earlier bishops. That is completely opposite to their entire cause, their entire philosophy, to say that later bishops can override earlier bishops. It's insane. Why do they even call themselves Orthodox Church? Why do they claim to call themselves the ancient church if they will just openly say we can override earlier bishops? And they will say that. You just got to show them the quotes. Sometimes they'll assume you're naive. Yes, did somebody want to say something?
Yeah, and that's not even the nature of truth anyways, right? Shouldn't the one that came first be true and then the second false?
Yes, whatever was from the beginning is true. And they don't believe that. They'll use the phrases, guys. Aramis and I were just talking about this, how you can hear a sermon from an Orthodox priest, and all of his phrases are correct, and even his philosophies are correct. You know, especially when they talk to the Protestants, they'll really sell the Protestant on the idea of, you need to go back to the beginning. But then if you show that the early church contradicts them, they'll say, the early church has no authority for hundreds of years, no authority. And they'll say outlandish things like, well, they weren't really dogmatic about anything for 300 years. Not until the ecumenical councils did they start to be dogmatic and really figure these things out. Ridiculous. Heretical. That is heresy to say such a thing. The church wasn't dogmatic. If there were no dogmas in the church for 300 years, how were people being excommunicated? They're being excommunicated over non-dogmas? Give me a break. And the concept that there is no such thing as a dogma until you have ecumenical councils is also outrageous. How can you say such a thing? No dogmas? How can anybody be excommunicated then? How can they claim that something is heretical? How can they be saying over and over again, we have the original faith that the apostles gave us, and if anybody contradicts it, they're out of the church? Isn't that a dogmatic statement? All of their things. I mean, are you really going to say the church wasn't dogmatic about the Trinity for 300 years? The church wasn't dogmatic about baptism? The church wasn't dogmatic about the Eucharist for 300 years? Give me a break. They know that that's a lie. You absolutely have dogmatics outside of ecumenical councils. Okay, but now let's answer the Ignatius claim. Does Ignatius say we must submit to the bishops and presbyters and deacons? Absolutely, he sure does. And again, guys, this is our strength against them. We're saying you need to obey the bishops, and they're saying, no, those bishops have no authority. See, we actually are obeying the bishops. The only question is whether we can baptize and have the Eucharist. That's the only issue. That it's not whether we should obey bishops. We absolutely believe you should obey the bishops, and that they're out. These people, the Cathodox, are outside of the church because they refuse to obey the bishops. But let's see here. Let's pull up some quotes. Here's Ignatius. Let's read a few quotes from Ignatius. He says, "But avoid all divisions." This is his letter to the Smyrnians. "Avoid all divisions as the beginning of evils." He says, we're supposed to avoid all divisions. So if somebody's making a division, are we going to avoid that, guys? Yes. If somebody divides themselves from the church's orthodox teaching, yes, we are going to avoid that division. Again, he says to this in his letter to Polycarp. He says, "Let not those who seem worthy of credit, but teach strange doctrines, fill you with apprehension. Stand firm, as does an anvil which is beaten. It is the part of a noble athlete to be wounded and yet to conquer. And especially we ought to bear all things for the sake of God, that he also may bear with us. Be ever becoming more zealous than what you are. Weigh carefully the times. Look for him who is above all, eternal and invisible, yet who became visible for our sakes, impalpable and impassible, yet who became passible on our account, and who in every kind of way suffered for our sakes." So he says, get ready, stand firm against these strange doctrines, be like an anvil that can take it, all these beatings. Again, he says to the Ephesians, "Do not err, my brethren. Those that corrupt families shall not inherit the kingdom of God. If then those who do this as respects the flesh have suffered death, How much more shall this be the case with anyone who corrupts by wicked doctrine the faith of God, for which Jesus Christ was crucified? Such a one, becoming defiled in this way, shall go away into everlasting fire, and so shall everyone that hearkens unto him. So guys, if we know somebody's teaching heresy, we are to flee from him. Ignatius is in our court. Okay, now let's read the quote that they all talk about, that we're all to stay with the bishop. He says, see that you all follow the bishop. This is his letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 8. See that you all follow the bishop, even as Jesus Christ does the Father. And the presbytery, that means the elders, as you would the apostles, and reverence the deacons, as being the institution of God. By the way, the Catholics and Orthodox do not reverence the deacons. There is an office called deaconess. It's a female deacon. And the Catholics and Orthodox have completely eradicated the office of deaconess. So much for them saying the offices of the church can never be destroyed. They've actually eradicated the office of deaconess. It does not exist in the Catholic or Orthodox Church, and it hasn't for centuries. Anyway, reverence the deacons as being the institution of God. Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one to whom he's entrusted it. Wow, now he's saying you actually can have the Eucharist just because the bishop has entrusted it to someone. So ordination isn't necessarily necessary. But he says more. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one whom he's entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude of the people be also. Even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. It is not lawful without the bishop, either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast, which is the Eucharist. But whatsoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. Now, guys, the Catholics and Orthodox would read this quote, and they would say to us, well, your Eucharist is just not even real. It's just not even blessed. It will be completely ineffectual, because Ignatius says, it's not lawful to do it without the bishop. But there's a big problem, guys. Do you know what the massive problem for the Orthodox and Catholics are? Do you know what the ultimate destructive argument against their entire cause here is? Guys, Catholics and Orthodox recognize baptisms outside of the church to be valid. They understand that bishop, or that a person who is not an ordained bishop can lawfully baptize. They believe that laity can baptize. They've always believed this. They've always taught this. This is something you find throughout church history. Let me give you an example real quick here, that you do not need a bishop to baptize, and that the church has always known about this. Let's look up. We're going to go down here to Rufinus. Okay, here we go. Here is good old Rufinus. Just 1 second, guys. Here we go. I found it. Okay, so this is an example of the historians talking about the laity baptizing in the church, and that it has always been considered... Oh, look, I even put it right after the section. I put it all together like it belongs. Okay, so one of the often repeated stories of the church, especially the post-Nicene church, is about Athanasius, guys. Athanasius was the chief debater against Arius, or against the Arians, not necessarily to Arian himself. But he was there at the Council of Nicaea, and he became the bishop of Alexandria. And by the way, Athanasius really liked Origen, just so everybody knows. Everybody who lived in Alexandria loved Origen, because that was Origen's seat. That was his place where he was most famous, and where his writings were so popular. Okay. So they love Athanasius, and one of their favorite stories about Athanasius that you'll hear is the story of him baptizing other children while he was a child. He was not a bishop. He was not a presbyter. He was not a deacon. He was a little child, and his baptisms were considered valid by the church. In fact, it's one of the most commonly repeated stories of the church because they thought it was so epic that a child was baptizing other people. Here's Rufinus. He says, "Now I do not think it out of place to trace back briefly his early years and to explain how he was educated as a boy, as we have found out from those who live with him. Once, when Bishop Alexander was celebrating the day of Peter Martyr in Alexandria, he was waiting in a place near the sea after the ceremonies were over for his clergy to gather for a banquet. There he saw from a distance some boys on the seashore playing a game in which, as they often do, they were mimicking a bishop and the things customarily done in church. Now, when he had gazed intently for a while at the boys, he saw that they were also performing some of the more secret and sacramental things. By the way, he doesn't even just say baptism here. Guys, it's even possible they were doing the Eucharist. But let's just, for the sake of argument, limit it to baptism. He, Peter of Alexandria, Peter the bishop, was disturbed and immediately ordered the clergy to be called to him and showed them what he was watching from a distance. Then he commanded them to go and get all the boys and bring them to him. When they arrived, he asked them what game they were playing and what they had done and how. At first they were afraid, as is usual at that age, and refused, but then they disclosed in due order what they had done, admitting that some catechumens had been baptized by them at the hands of Athanasius, who had played the part of bishop in their childish game. Then he carefully inquired of those who were said to have been baptized what they had been asked and what they had answered. Now, guys, why is this important that he asked them, well, what did you ask them and what did they answer? Well, guys, this is exactly what Ignatius is talking about. He says, make sure that you've got the bishop there so that when you're doing a baptism or the Eucharist, he says, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. You see, guys, what makes it secure and valid isn't the ordination of the priest. It's the fact that they're properly invoking God and saying the words. They are properly confessing sin and making a prayer to God to wash them of their sins. They're renouncing Satan at their baptism, and then they're baptized. And they're baptized using the correct words. I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That is what makes it a valid baptism. And the reason why it would be insecure to have a bishop there is not because, you don't have somebody ordained doing it. It's because the bishop is righteous. He is wiser than everyone. He knows how to do it properly. And he himself is so pure that his prayers will be acceptable to God when he is offering the Eucharist, guys. Because the Eucharist is a sacrifice. And God will not accept a sacrifice from an evil man, which, by the way, is contrary to what the Catholics and the Orthodox teach. They think that even a wicked priest's sacrifice will be acceptable to God, but we're about to read some quotes where all of the church fathers unanimously teach. We're talking everybody from the pre-Nicene era will say, no, a wicked priest's sacrifice will not be acceptable. His ordination does not matter at all. And Ignatius even confirms that. He says, the bishop administers the Eucharist or someone who he entrusts it to. That means the ordination doesn't matter, guys. And you know that the ordination doesn't matter because of the fact that if a wicked priest offers the Eucharist, it's invalid. It's the righteousness of a priest that is so important about the priesthood. The thing that makes the priesthood so essential is that he is righteous and pure. He's been selected out of all the people in the church to baptize and especially to offer the Eucharist because of his great reputation, that he is such a pure man. Get it? Okay, so that's what secure and valid means. That's why when they're questioning these boys, they're asking them, what words did you say? To see if it was a valid baptism. Get it? So here's where it says they played the part. And the same, they put the questions. Let's see here. Yes, he carefully inquired of those who were said to have been baptized what they had been asked and what they had answered. And the same of him who had put the questions. And when he saw that everything was according to the manner of our religion, he conferred with a council of clerics and then ruled, so it is reported, that those on whom water had been poured after the questions had been asked and answered fully need not repeat the baptism, but that those things should be completed which are customarily done by priests. So they go and teach them the faith. He says, as for Athanasius and those who had played the parts of presbyters and ministers in the game, he called together their parents, and having put them under oath, handed them over to be reared for the church. But a short time later, after Athanasius had been thoroughly educated by a clerk and received adequate instruction from a teacher of literature, he was given back at once to the priest by his parents, like a deposit from the Lord kept faithfully. And like another Samuel, was brought up in the Lord's temple. And so he was appointed by Alexander, as he was going to his father's in a good old age, to wear the priestly ephod after him. So you guys see how this is absolutely destructive, and there are many more examples. I'm about to show you in just a second many more examples of this. This destroys their argument. This destroys their argument that you must have a priest do it, doesn't it? And not only does it destroy their argument that you need a priest to baptize, but also that you need a priest to offer the Eucharist. Why? Well, because when Ignatius says that so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. Ignatius is not only talking about baptism here, is he? He's talking about the Eucharist too. Therefore, if the Catholic and the Orthodox Church have to recognize baptisms that are performed by either laity or even people outside of the church as valid, then they have to also recognize the Eucharist as valid, even if it's performed by a child, even if it's performed by someone who's not ordained as a priest. It is valid if the person offering it is acceptable to God, and if he has properly invoked Christ and the Holy Spirit to imbue the elements when they're consecrated, when they're prayed over. And I'll give you some examples to show you that. So, just to recap, you guys understand my argument here. When Ignatius says, make sure that everything you do is lawful, the thing that makes it lawful is not just the ordination of a bishop, but specifically that the bishop is a righteous man who knows how to baptize and how to offer the Eucharist, how to bless it. And I repeat one more time in case the argument is in your brain, but you know that's true because the church later on says if an ordained bishop is a wicked person, then his priest or his sacrifice is not acceptable to God. That tells you the ordination is not what matters. It's not the main thing. Rather, ordination is a mark that a person has been chosen to do these things because of his righteousness, because he stands out from the rest of the laity. Make sense? Any questions about that? I'll read you some more examples, though. I want you to be really convinced about this Athanasius story, because the Catholics and Orthodox absolutely hate this story and others like it, where it talks about the laity baptizing. Here's Sozomen giving the same story about Athanasius. I'll just give you 3 accounts from it real quick so you can have it drilled in you and you can know this is real. So Sozomen talks about Athanasius. He says, he displayed great aptitude in the exercise of the ecclesiastical functions and fitness for the priesthood, and was, so to speak, from his earliest years, self-taught. It is said that the following incident occurred to him in his youth. It was the custom of the Alexandrians to celebrate with great pomp an annual festival in honor of one of their bishops named Peter, who had suffered martyrdom. Alexander, who then conducted the church, engaged in the celebration of this festival, and after having completed the worship, he remained on the spot, awaiting the arrival of some guests whom he expected to breakfast. I'm sorry, I meant to say Alexander. I think I said Peter earlier. But it was on the anniversary of Peter's death, a martyr named Peter. So yeah, Alexander, in the meantime, he chanced to cast his eyes towards the sea and perceived some children playing on the shore and amusing themselves by imitating the bishop and the ceremonies of the church. At first he considered the mimicry as innocent and took pleasure in witnessing it. But when they touched upon the unutterable, he was troubled. What do you guys think he means when he says the unutterable? These boys were doing something in their little liturgy.
Sure.
It is something unutterable. It is something that is not for people outside the church to know about. And again, I will emphasize, this is not even just talking about baptism. This is also talking about the Eucharist. I can even give you some quotes where they refer to the Eucharist as the unutterable, or where they refer to it as the unspeakable mystery. Anyway, this is talking about Christ's body and blood. That's why they refer to it that way. Okay, but when he sees the boys touching upon the unutterable, he was troubled. It says, they confessed that Athanasius was their bishop and leader, and that many of the children who had not been initiated had been baptized by him. On finding that the exact routine of the church had been accurately observed by them, he consulted the priests around him on the subject and decided that it would be unnecessary to rebaptize those who, in their simplicity, had been judged worthy of the divine grace. So that's the second witness at Sozomen. And then here is... Let's see here. Oh, yeah, this is an example of when they're talking about the sacrifice. Who says this here? Who says this? Is this John Chrysostom? I don't even think I wrote the name here. I think this is John Chrysostom. He says, do you wish to learn how he, Jesus, becomes a table for you? He who eats me, says he, as I live because of the Father, he also shall live because of me. And that he becomes a home for you. He that eats my flesh abides in me, and I in him. And concerning the greatness of the sacrifice, adorn the members of your body, etc., etc. I think I may have dropped the wrong quote here. Oh, no, it is the right one. He gets to the end of the quote, so he's talking about the Eucharist here. And then at the end he says, and does it not deserve the utmost punishment if, with the same eyes with which you look upon the unspeakable and dread mysteries, you look upon harlots and commit adultery in your heart? So this is John Chrysostom referring to the Eucharist as the unspeakable and dread mysteries. I was just giving that as an example. There are more. You can look them up. So I only use that as an example to show that the Eucharist very well may have even been practiced. Because, guys, people used to have the Eucharist right after baptism. For instance, Justin Martyr says, but we, after we have thus washed him who has been convinced, blah, 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 he says, there then is brought to the president of the brethren bread and a cup of wine mixed with water. This is the practice of the church, guys. You have Eucharist immediately after baptism. So we don't know, but at the very least we can establish that these boys were being baptized. And look, here's the Catholic Encyclopedia, where they're absolutely coping, they're absolutely dreading this story, and others, it's not the only one. But listen to the Catholic Encyclopedia trying to say, oh, well, hopefully this event never happened because that would destroy our false narrative that only clergy can baptize people. They say, the Bollandists deal gravely with this story, and writers as difficult to satisfy as Archdeacon Farrar and the late Dean Stanley are ready to accept it as bearing on its face every indication of truth. But whether in its present form or in the modified version to be found in Socrates, so that's a third version we're about to read, who omits all reference to the baptism and says that the game was an imitation of the priesthood and the order of consecrated persons, the tale raises a number of chronological difficulties and suggests even graver questions. Perhaps a not impossible explanation of its origin may be found in the theory that it was one of the many floating myths set in movement by popular imagination. So they're trying to say this story about Athanasius is a myth that was floating around by popular imagination. And they're saying, yeah, it's got some grave implications, they're saying. This is a serious problem for us, if really anybody can baptize. So I want to point out here that they say, well, maybe whether this story in its present form or in a modified version to be found in Socrates, who omits all reference to this, the tales raise a number of problems. So they're suggesting that they're suggesting this idea developed over time, guys. Don't believe it. It's a lie. They're saying maybe it just got more and more extreme, and then people started saying that there was a baptism, and they're like, well, Socrates, at least, he doesn't say that it's a baptism. He just says it was an imitation of the priesthood and the order of consecrated persons. Okay, guys, I saved Socrates for last. You ready to read Socrates' account of it? By the way, Socrates lives after Rufinus and Sozomen, so I don't know why his account is to be believed more than theirs when they came before him. But let's read Socrates Scholasticus. He gives the same story a little after this. Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria, having died, Athanasius was set over that church. And then he says, Rufinus relates. So he's now referencing Rufinus' story, because he knows Rufinus gave the account before he did. Rufinus relates that this Athanasius, when quite a boy, played with others of his own age at a sacred game. This was an imitation of the priesthood and the order of consecrated persons. In this game, therefore, Athanasius was allotted the episcopal chair, that means the bishop chair, and each of the other lads personated either a presbyter or a deacon. The children engaged in this sport on the day in which the memory of the martyr and Bishop Peter was celebrated. Now at that time, Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria, happened to pass by, observed the play in which they were engaged, and having sent for the children, inquired from them the part each had been assigned in the game, conceiving that something might be portended by that which had been done, meaning, might be predicted that maybe these boys are going to end up being great men someday. But especially Athanasius, and having afterwards ordained him deacon on his becoming of adult age, he brought him to Nicaea to assist him in the disputations there when the synod was convened. So he's talking about the Council of Nicaea. And then listen to Socrates. He says, this account of Athanasius Rufinus has given in his own writings, nor is it improbable that it took place, for many transactions of this kind have often occurred. Well, sorry, Catholics and Orthodox, your coping ended up leading you nowhere. You led us to Socrates, and what did Socrates say? He says, don't let anybody doubt that this actually happened. This kind of thing happens very often. Can you believe their boldness? Now, all this started because we were talking about this statement where there's no salvation outside of the church, right? And we already said that Cyprian here, who says that we must all unite in the church and we must obey the bishops, he's quoting Cyprian. Cyprian elsewhere, as we're about to read, says that we have to flee from evil bishops and evil priests. And he was an example of that. He even contradicted the Bishop of Rome, Pope Stephen, and said that he was in heresy when Stephen wanted to accept heretical baptisms. So this is quite ironic, isn't it? That Cyprian, the one they're relying on here, at another time says we must flee from evil priests, and Cyprian absolutely endorses having the Eucharist apart from priests and baptizing apart from priests. How do we know that? And by the way, guys, as I was just saying to you, Ray, it's an amazing thing that if I quote Cyprian on the subject of the church's unity, the Cathodox will say, Amen. But if I quote Cyprian saying the whole church will fall away someday and that we must flee sinful heretical priests and have the Eucharist by ourselves, then they'll say, Cyprian's an idiot. So let's see then what Cyprian actually says. Let's see. All right, we've read this quote many times, guys, but this is Cyprian's big letter 67 where he says, "Nor let the people flatter themselves that they can be free from the contagion of sin while communicating," meaning having communion, "with a priest who is a sinner and yielding their consent to the unjust and unlawful episcopacy of their overseer, when the divine reproof by Hosea the prophet threatens and says, 'Their sacrifices shall be as the bread of morning, all that eat thereof shall be polluted,' teaching manifestly and showing that all are absolutely bound to the sin who have been contaminated by the sacrifice of a profane and unrighteous priest, which moreover we find to be manifested also in Numbers, when Korah and Dathan and Abiram claimed for themselves the power of sacrificing in opposition to Aaron the priest." Guys, he's talking about actually validly ordained bishops. And he's saying, no, their sacrifices are not legitimate because they're sinful and they're heretical and they oppose the church with their heresies. Therefore, their ordination means nothing. He says, "There also the Lord commanded by Moses that the people should be separated from them, lest being associated with the wicked, themselves also should be bound closely in the same wickedness. Separate yourselves," said he, "from the tents of these wicked and hardened men, and touch not those things which belong to them, lest you perish together in their sins. On which account, a people obedient to the Lord's precepts and fearing God ought to separate themselves from a sinful prelate, and not associate themselves with the sacrifices of a sacrilegious priest, especially since they themselves have the power either of choosing worthy priests or of rejecting unworthy ones." So you see, guys, he's telling us to get away from heretical priests. The Catholics and Orthodox do not teach this doctrine. They teach that you must obey your priest in whatever town you live in. You need to go to his parish, obey everything he says. Don't worry about his sacrifices. It's okay if he's a sinner or a heretic. And we're not even just talking about contradicting the early church's doctrines, guys. We're talking like even if he contradicts the Orthodox churches or the Catholic church's current teachings, you should still go to that guy and have communion with him. And you're not polluted. Not until he's like officially excommunicated by the church. Then you have to stay away from him. But you can actually just know that he's a pedophile or whatever. You just keep on having the Eucharist with him. It's fine because he's ordained. For them, it's all about the ordination. Okay, and Cyprian continues. They want us to listen to Cyprian. Let's listen to Cyprian. Cyprian doesn't contradict himself. He's completely consistent. I'll even show you that quote from On the Unity of the Church, where even when he says we must all stay with the bishops, he says the reason we stay with all the priests is because the priests agree with each other. But if the priests don't agree with each other, then you don't stay with the priests who are falling away from the rest. He says, "For which reason you must diligently observe and keep the practice delivered from divine tradition and apostolic observance, which is also maintained among us and almost throughout all the provinces. Nor let it disturb you, dearest brethren, if with some in these last times either an uncertain faith is wavering, or a fear of God without religion is vacillating, or a peaceable concord does not continue. These things have been foretold as about to happen in the end of the world, and it was predicted by the voice of the Lord and by the testimony of the apostles, that now that the world is failing and the Antichrist is drawing near, everything good shall fail, but evil and adverse things shall prosper. Now, what does he mean by everything good shall fail? Well, he just told you. What's the subject here? Bishops falling away from the faith. That's the subject. He says, don't be surprised. Don't let it disturb you, brethren. These things were predicted as about to happen. Everything good shall fail. And he is talking about eventually a point being reached where there are no more bishops. How do we know that? Because of what he says next. He says, yet although in these last times evangelic rigor has not so failed in the church of God, nor the strength of Christian virtue or faith so languished, that there is not left a portion of the priests which in no respect give way under these ruins of things and wrecks of faith, but bold and steadfast they maintain the honor of the divine majesty and the priestly dignity with full observance of fear. So he says they've got a portion of priests still obeying in the late 200s. But Cyprian is very disturbed. He sees that this church is falling away, and he sees that this was predicted to happen. And guys, if he's saying this in the late 200s, he absolutely would say that the whole church has fallen away if he could see where they are right now. He would absolutely say that. There is no doubt. Now let's answer this question. Let's answer this question of whether he would approve of people having the Eucharist and baptizing without the priests. Let's see. Let's see if we can find a quote where he says that. Are you guys still with me?
Yep.
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, here's Tertullian. This is Tertullian. Now you guys may be asking, why Tertullian? Well, I'll tell you in just a second. First, we're going to read Tertullian. This is his book, An Exhortation on Chastity, chapter 7. He says, are not even we laity priests? It is written, a kingdom also, and priests to his God and Father has he made us. It is the authority of the church and the honor which has acquired sanctity through the joint session of the order, which has established the difference between the order and the laity. Accordingly, where there is no joint session of the ecclesiastical order, meaning where there are no bishops, where there is no ecclesiastical order, you offer the Eucharist and baptize and are priest alone for yourself. But where three are, a church is, albeit they be laics. For each individual lives by his own faith, nor is there exception of persons with God, since it is not hearers of the law who are justified by the Lord, but doers, according to what the apostle withal says. Therefore, if you have the right of a priest in your own person, in cases of necessity, it behooves you also to have likewise the discipline of a priest, whenever it may be necessary to have the right of a priest. If you are a digamist, meaning if you're married multiple times, do you baptize? If you are a digamist, do you offer the Eucharist? How much more capital a crime is it for a digamist laic to act as a priest, when the priest himself, if he turned digamist, is deprived of the power of acting the priest? You hear Tertullian, guys, saying, if a priest gets married multiple times, then he's deprived of the power of acting as the priest automatically. There is no unconditional respect for the office of the priesthood in the early church. He says, in this hypothetical question, he says, but to necessity, you say, indulgence is granted. So he's saying this person hypothetically might respond, well, Tertullian, if there really were an emergency where we had to act as a priest, give us a little bit of slack here. If we have multiple marriages here, what if there's nobody who's available to offer the Eucharist except people who've been married multiple times? Like, what if we've all been married multiple times? You gotta give us a little bit of slack here. You can't expect us to actually have the discipline of a priest. So he says, but to necessity, indulgence is granted, you might say. And he says, no necessity is excusable, which is avoidable. In a word, shun to be found guilty of digamy, and you do not expose yourself to the necessity of administering what a digamist may not lawfully administer. God wills us all to be so conditioned as to be ready at all times and places to undertake the duties of his sacraments. Wow. Total destruction of the Catholics and Orthodox, but what are they going to say? We know what they're going to say. Oh, that's Tertullian, man. Tertullian, he was excommunicated at the end of his life, and so, we don't have to listen to him. Well, guys, to say such a thing, to say that we're going to throw out all the writings of somebody just because they became a bishop at the end of their life is really ridiculous. Huh? Just because they became a heretic at the end of their life? What did I say?
Bishop.
Oh, just because they became a bishop? No, I meant to say, just because somebody becomes a heretic at the end of their life does not mean that everything they ever said was wrong. And we know that the church continued to revere Tertullian's writings, even if the man himself fell away from the faith. For instance, if you look up anything, I'm just going to do this randomly. Church fathers on here. Look, Mary's perpetual virginity. We can go on these websites. Maybe I should say something like baptism. We're just going to do a random thing. Okay, necessity of baptisms. Here are all these Catholic websites. They're going to give you all the quotes. Hermas, Justin Martyr, Tertullian. See, guys, they don't hesitate to use Tertullian. They're always quoting Tertullian and Origen. And Cyprian, of course. So, guys, don't be fooled by these Catholics and Orthodox. They will reject Tertullian when it's convenient for them, but they'll cite him whenever it is convenient for them. They'll say, "Oh, well, he agrees with the whole church right now, so we're gonna quote him." And here, he seems to be in agreement with the entire early church, but he disagrees with us, our current heresy, so we're just not going to quote him. But in that case, it's not just Tertullian they're not quoting. They're not going to quote anybody from the early church. Okay, so why are we quoting Tertullian here? Why do we think Cyprian would agree with Tertullian wholeheartedly? Listen to Jerome in his book On Illustrious Men, where he talks about all the church fathers that have lived in the pre-Nicene church and why you should read their writings, and he gives biographies of them. So he gives a little biography of Tertullian. He says, Tertullian, the presbyter, now regarded as chief of the Latin writers after Victor and Apollonius, was from the city of Carthage in the province of Africa, and was the son of a proconsul or centurion, a man of keen and vigorous character. He flourished chiefly in the reign of the Emperor Severus and Antoninus Caracalla, and wrote many volumes, which we pass by because they are well known to most. So he's saying everybody already knows Tertullian's writings. He says, I myself have seen a certain Paul, an old man of Concordia, a town of Italy, who, while he himself was a very young man, had been secretary to the blessed Cyprian, who was already advanced in age. He said that he himself had seen how Cyprian was accustomed never to pass a day without reading Tertullian, and that he frequently said to him, Give me the master, meaning by this, Tertullian. So guys, Cyprian read Tertullian constantly. Cyprian was so absolutely respectful toward Tertullian that he would call him the master. Hand me the master. And why should this surprise anybody? Tertullian was extremely famous all around the world, but Tertullian was from the town of which city, guys? Do you know which city? Where's Tertullian from? What's his city? Anybody remember?
Carthage.
Carthage. And what city is Cyprian from? What city? Carthage. Cyprian of Carthage. That's what he's called. Cyprian was a bishop of Carthage and an early Christian writer. So guys, Cyprian and Tertullian are in the same city. We have Jerome confirming it, that Cyprian always read Tertullian and that he referred to him as the master. And you hear Tertullian saying, listen, in cases of necessity, you guys need to offer the Eucharist. Tertullian is not only talking about times of persecution, where a bishop might be martyred, and so in that case we have to offer the Eucharist. It is true, that's a situation that would have been common. Tertullian is saying that's a case of necessity, where you guys would need to offer the Eucharist yourselves and baptize yourselves without the bishop. But Tertullian is also in agreement with Cyprian, and Cyprian is in agreement with Tertullian, that if a bishop were to fall away from the faith, we would have to baptize and offer the Eucharist apart from our evil bishop. So they're completely in agreement with each other. And if they want to reject that argument I've made, they can do that if they feel like it. Well, why don't we just read some more quotes on the subject of what we do in the case of a bishop who falls away from the faith. And where were we? Have we answered everything here? Yes, outside the church there's no salvation. Yeah, well, Cyprian again, he says that the church is going to fall away. Yes. Anybody have any questions so far? Anybody want me to answer any particular thing that's on their mind?
I just want to make sure I understand it. So your first argument would be, I think his name was Irenaeus, and that he performed the baptism at his young age, and the church. I can't pronounce that. I'm sorry. Wait, what did you say?
Athanasius.
Athanasius. Okay. Hold on one second.
You gonna write it down?
Okay, I'm sorry about that. My mom came in. Yeah. So that one, I forgot the other one. I can't believe I just forgot it. And the priests being the contradiction within them not accepting certain church fathers' writings, though they actually do on their website.
Yeah, they'll quote Tertullian when they feel like it. They know that Tertullian was very orthodox and was totally in line with the rest of the church, and that his writings were some of the most read and most respected in the church until he became a heretic. But I mean, his writings were still revered for many years after that. Incredibly, guys, an amazing thing about Tertullian is Tertullian did write a couple books even after he became a heretic. And people still considered those books to be really great books, even though they knew Tertullian himself had become a heretic. Because he still represented the truth. He represented orthodoxy on most issues.
Yeah. And was there another one that I might have missed? Because
As far as arguments go, you mean?
yeah.
Well, I want to question you guys now. I don't question you guys very much when we're having these calls, but Ray, you're still there, right?
Hello?
Raymond, yes. Well, Ray, you were the one who showed me this man Jake in his letter, his little message here, saying, "Well, Cyprian says that there's no forgiveness of sins outside of valid priests." So, what would your response be to Jake, knowing what you know now?
I'd probably say to him that the church has fallen away, and they called for times like this, and for times like this called for desperate measures. They they didn't necessarily ever say that the church was gonna maintain. They pretty explicitly said that it was gonna fall away.
Yes, Cyprian said it would happen. He said that the church would fall away. That's what you should respond with. Try to get him to the point where he denounces Cyprian as quickly as possible, because that's more.
Well, again, that was a little bit ago, so I wouldn't even message him now.
I see. Ray, were you listening to everything I was saying, or were you busy?
I mean, I'm working, but I'm listening.
I see. The takeaway, guys, is that all Christians are priests, and that at any time if there are no bishops around, no valid bishops, we have to take on the duty of acting as priests. That was the church's teaching. The church's historic teaching is that anybody can baptize, but you're in danger of, if you're going to take on that duty of baptizing or offering the Eucharist, you're in a lot of danger if you're not a priest, because you may not necessarily know how to do it correctly. That's the danger. It's not that you don't have the authority, it's just that it's dangerous. So when Ignatius says, "It is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast," meaning the Eucharist, he says, "But whatsoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid." Ignatius is warning you not to do these things without the bishop. He warns them, don't be doing it. In fact, a little bit earlier, he talks about people actually doing this in the church, and he says, that is not lawful. That is dangerous. But he doesn't say a baptism absolutely doesn't count if it's done apart from the bishop. He never indicates that. And I reiterate to you guys, most Orthodox, even to this day, consider baptisms done by Protestants to be legitimate baptisms. In many, many Orthodox churches, except for a few, like the Antiochian side, if you were to be baptized in a Protestant church and come to the Orthodox Church, they would not rebaptize you. They would say your baptism counted. It is only a certain few Orthodox that say you have to be rebaptized. They are double talkers, and so if they say that about baptism, why in the world would that not also apply to the Eucharist? What, is God going to ensure that any person can be brought into the covenant through baptism, but that we just can't necessarily be maintained in the covenant? We can't receive our regular medicine? You can receive initial salvation, but then you can't be kept in the covenant. Sorry. That's ridiculous. But we have more quotes from the church fathers, even in the post-Nicene era, where they say that the laity can offer the Eucharist. But again, they should be pure if they're doing it. Oh, but there are so many quotes I've saved here where the pre-Nicene church says if a priest is a corrupt man, if he's evil, then his baptism or even his Eucharist is rejected by God. I could read you a few if you guys want to hear some. Here's Shepherd of Hermas. And the angel says to Hermas, "Moreover, adultery is committed not only by those who pollute their flesh, but by those who imitate the heathen in their actions. Wherefore, if anyone persists in such deeds and repents not, withdraw from him and cease to live with him. Otherwise, you're a sharer in his sin." Now, this is talking about married couples, but the concept still is there. That if you continue to have fellowship with someone who you know to be practicing sin, you are a sharer in his sin, and you're commanded to withdraw. This is the teaching of the church. Here's Origen talking about binding and loosing. Remember that Jesus gives the authority to bind and loose, to forgive or retain sins from people who are coming into
So
the church.
Luke,
Yes?
so off that quote, so like, God forbid, for example, like if Aramis were to sin, were you to like stay away from him,
Well, of course.
even if he repents?
Well, if he repents, Ray, of course I would not stay away from him. This is talking about people who persist in such deeds without repenting.
Okay.
Wherefore, if anyone persists in such deeds and repents not, withdraw from him. Get it? You get it, Ray?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, here's Origen. He's talking about binding and loosing, which refers to what? I already said it. Somebody tell me what binding and loosing refers to.
The sins that you
Forgive
will,
sins and
the sins that you don't. Well,
What?
like in the sense that whether you forgive somebody of that sin or you persist on it.
And Mikey,
That's
how would a priest do that, practically speaking? Give someone forgiveness of sins or retain their sin and keep it bound? How would that
well.
look practically?
I think if they persist, like if they held on to it, I guess excommunication or at least like staying away from them for a
That's true.
while
What does excommunication mean? What does excommunicate mean?
to like not fellowship with them anymore.
That's true, but it also means something more specific. Does anybody know what excommunication means?
Not to
I thought
have
it just meant
communion with
not
them
fellowship.
anymore.
not to have communion with them.
That's correct. It means you don't have communion with them.
Okay.
So to excommunicate means somebody's officially being cut off from having communion. And when a priest says you are not repentant of your sin or you have not done deeds to show your repentance, then that priest would say, your sins are bound. You are not allowed to have the Eucharist until you show that you're really repentant with deeds that show your repentance. This would be if somebody had done something very grievous, like adultery, or if they denied Christ under persecution. That person wouldn't be let back into the church to have the Eucharist, which is the forgiveness of sins. They would be cut off from it. And that's for their own protection too, because they'll only be judged if they dare have the Eucharist before they've truly repented. So it's not just that priest cutting this person off from salvation, but inviting them and instructing them to do what's necessary to be forgiven. That's why John the Baptist says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" When they were coming to be baptized. But John the Baptist wanted deeds of repentance first. He said, "Therefore bear fruit in keeping with repentance." Don't just come up here and be baptized. Show that you're sorry. And God says the same thing with the Eucharist. Don't just come up here and partake of the Lord's body and blood. If you're a recent practicing sinner, that's insulting. And it's dangerous too, because how do I know you're not just going to jump right back into that sin if you were just doing it yesterday? So they would let some time go by. That was the practice of the church. Okay, so binding and loosing is what again, Mikey? What is binding? If I bind somebody's sin, if I were a bishop, I bind your sin. What does that mean?
You're can't do communion no more.
Right. I'm not letting you have communion. Right. Hypothetically speaking. Obviously, I'm not a bishop.
Yeah, not allowing
Wait,
them.
Yes, Raheem?
is that oblation? Like,
Yes, that's right. It's also called an oblation. An oblation is a sacrifice. It's basically the same word as a sacrifice, but an oblation is a liquid sacrifice, something that's poured out. Get it? Okay, well, here's Origen. He's going to talk on the subject. He says, "But when those who maintain the function of the episcopate make use of this word as Peter, and having received the keys of the kingdom of heaven from the Savior, teach that things bound by them, that is to say, condemned, are also bound in heaven, and that those which have obtained remission by them are also loosed in heaven, we must say that they speak wholesomely, if they have the same way of life, on account of which it was said to that Peter, 'You are Peter.' And if they are such that upon them the church is built by Christ, and to them with good reason, this could be referred, and the gates of Hades ought not to prevail against him when he wishes to bind and loose. But if he is tightly bound, if that bishop is tightly bound with the cords of his sins, to no purpose does he bind and loose." So he's saying, if a priest is a righteous man, if his own sins are loosed, then he has the power to bind and loose. But if he himself is a sinner, he says to no purpose does he bind and loose. And this is referring to the Eucharist. Because no bishop had the power to just tell somebody his sins were forgiven apart from the Eucharist. The church has never taught that any priest has that. Even the Catholics and Orthodox would never teach such a thing, that you could bind or loose, somebody's sins apart from the Eucharist. So, this is Origen confirming a priest doesn't have the power to grant the remission of sins if he himself is a sinner. His Eucharist, his sacrifice, is rejected. And you guys caught me at a time when I've not organized so many quotes. I have a lot of quotes here, but they're not organized by any means. Here's Jerome, though. This is in the post-Nicene church. He says, "What I'm going to say will perhaps offend many." This is Jerome writing in the late 300s, early 400s. "What I'm going to say will perhaps offend many, yet I will say it, and good men will not be angry with me, because they will not feel the sting of conscience. Sometimes it is the fault of the bishops, who choose into the ranks of the clergy not the best but the cleverest men, and think the more simple as well as innocent ones incapable. Or as though they were distributing the offices of an earthly service, they give posts to their kindred and relations, or they listen to the dictates of wealth, and worse than all, they give promotion to the clergy who besmear them with flattery." So he's talking about the post-Nicene church, people becoming bishops because they bribed somebody or because they were very tricky. He says, "You see then that the blessedness of a bishop, priest, or deacon does not lie in the fact that they are bishops, priests, or deacons, but in their having the virtues which their names and offices imply. Otherwise, if a deacon be holier than his bishop, his lower grade will not give him a worse standing with Christ. If it were so, Stephen the deacon, the first to wear the martyr's crown, would be less in the kingdom of heaven than many bishops, and than Timothy and Titus, whom I venture to make neither inferior nor yet superior to him. Just as in the legions of the army there are generals, tribunes, centurions, javelin men, and light-armed troops, common soldiers and companies, but once the battle begins, all distinctions of rank are dropped, and the one thing looked for is valor, so too, in this camp and in this battle, in which we contend against devils, not names but deeds are needed, and under the true commander Christ. Not the man who has the highest title has the greatest fame, but he who is the bravest warrior." So Jerome says, I got to say it, even if this is going to offend some people, but there are a lot of people who are being ordained to be bishops who have no business being a bishop. And he says, your title means nothing to God. Your virtue is what matters to God. He says, it's not the title. The blessedness of bishop, priest, or deacon doesn't lie in the fact that they are bishops, priests, or deacons, but it's in their having the virtues which their names and offices imply. Here again Jerome says, "Salt that has lost its savor is good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of swine. If a monk fall, a priest shall intercede for him, but who shall intercede for a fallen priest?" Well, he's in big trouble, isn't he? He says, God hates the sacrifices of these heretics and pushes them away from himself. And whenever they come together in the name of the Lord, he abhors their stench and holds his nose. That's Jerome's commentary on Amos. So Jerome doesn't have any concept of God accepting the sacrifices of priests no matter what, just because of their office title. And neither did the pre-Nicene church. Here's Athanasius. He says, lest then this should happen, be pleased, beloved, to shun those who hold the impiety of Arius, and moreover, to avoid those who, while they pretend not to hold with Arius, yet worship with the impious. And we are especially bound to fly, that means flee, from the communion of men whose opinions we hold in execration, meaning we hate them. If then anyone come to you, and as Blessed John says, brings with him the right doctrine, say to him, all hail, and receive such a one as a brother. But if anyone pretend that he confesses the right faith, but appear to communicate with those others, exhort him to abstain from such communion, and if he promise to do so, treat him as a brother. But if he persist in a contentious spirit, him avoid. And I have so many more quotes on this subject. I've got so many it would probably blow your mind. Let's get some Irenaeus. He's pre-Nicene. Here is Irenaeus. He says much here. Let me get a drink of water. I'm just going to read the red parts because it's so long. We've talked about these subjects quite a bit, guys. It's just not in a big orderly fashion yet because we haven't put it all together to release it. Hopefully you guys are following. Nolan, they asked some questions about what the Orthodox and Catholics would say about us having to obey the church unconditionally. Right now I'm going over some quotes where we were just showing that nobody in the early church taught that we should just obey bishops unconditionally. Even in the post-Nicene church, in the 300s and 400s, they still were not teaching that concept. Here is Irenaeus, though, one of the most respected bishops in church history. He says, wherefore it is incumbent to obey the presbyters who are in the church, those who, as I have shown, possess the succession from the apostles. Well, that rules out the post-Nicene bishops, guys, because apostolic succession was destroyed with the ordination of bishops by emperors. So he says, yes, obey those elders who are in the church, those who have the succession from the apostles, those who, together with the succession of the episcopate, have received the certain gift of truth according to the good pleasure of the Father. But it is also incumbent, meaning you're obligated, to hold in suspicion others who depart from the primitive succession, and assemble themselves together in any place whatsoever, looking upon them either as heretics of perverse minds, or as schismatics, puffed up and self-pleasing, or again as hypocrites, acting thus for the sake of lucre and vainglory. Lucre would be money. So that would be any bishop who's getting a salary. He's getting money to preach. For all of these have fallen from the truth. And the heretics indeed, who bring strange fire to the altar of God, namely strange doctrines, shall be burned up by the fire from heaven, as were Nadab and Abihud. But such as rise up in opposition to the truth and exhort others against the church of God shall remain among those in hell, being swallowed up by an earthquake, even as those who were with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. But those who cleave asunder and separate the unity of the church shall receive from God the same punishment as Jeroboam did. Those, however, who are believed to be presbyters by many, but serve their own lusts and do not place the fear of God supreme in their hearts, but conduct themselves with contempt toward others, and are puffed up with the pride of holding the chief seat, and work evil deeds in secret, saying, no one sees me, shall be convicted by the word, who does not judge after outward appearance, nor looks upon the countenance, but the heart. He says, from all such persons, therefore, it behooves us to keep aloof, but to adhere to those who, as I have already observed, do hold the doctrine of the apostles, and who, together with the order of the priesthood, display sound speech and blameless conduct for the confirmation and correction of others. Well, if you obey that, guys, you can't stay with the Catholics and Orthodox, the idol worshippers, the warmongers, and the whoremongers. He says, "Where therefore the gifts of the Lord have been placed, there it behooves us to learn the truth, namely from those who possess that succession of the church, which is from the apostles, and among whom exists that which is sound and blameless in conduct, as well as that which is unadulterated and incorrupt in speech. For these also preserve this faith of ours in one God who created all things. And they expound the scriptures to us without danger, neither blaspheming God, nor dishonoring the patriarchs, nor despising the prophets." Well, guys, these priests do despise the church fathers. They even despise the apostles. They think that doctrines can just develop over time. I love, too, how they will say, well, it's, like, it develops gradually. And yet you find these people not even developing gradually, but just all of a sudden, boom, after a Council of Nicaea, we're going to have emperors involved in ordaining bishops. Just out of nowhere. It wasn't even gradual. That's a joke. Here, Cyprian is on that subject, having people outside the church be judging the bishops within the church. He says, "Is the dignity of the Catholic Church," and now he's talking about heretics here, but notice how it actually applies to emperors. He says, "Is the dignity of the Catholic Church, dearest brother, to be laid aside? Is the faithful and uncorrupted majesty of the people placed within it, and the priestly authority and power also, all to be laid aside for this, that those who are set without the church may say that they wish to judge concerning a prelate in the church? Heretics judging concerning a Christian, wounded men about a whole man, maimed concerning a sound man, lapsed concerning one who stands fast, guilty concerning their judge, sacrilegious men concerning a priest? What is left but that the church should yield to the capital," meaning the government, "and that while the priests depart and remove the Lord's altar, the images and idols should pass over with their altars into the sacred and venerable assembly of our clergy." Well, Cyprian's a prophet. He literally just prophesied what would happen. That is what is left. He says, what's left but that the church should yield to the capital? Well, that happened. The church now the church, at least while we had emperors, yielded to the capital of the empire and obeyed the emperor. And what else? He even says, and that the images and idols should pass over with their altars into the sacred and venerable assembly. Well, that happened, guys. Then they brought idolatry into the church. I could probably go on for a long time here. I wonder, guys, do your eyes glaze over when we're reading? You guys paying attention? You guys ever go back and listen to these calls and make sure you picked up on all of it?
You should. I go back all the time.
Good, very good.
I do too.
Very good. Well, we need to put these quotes on the website. We are putting them up. We put like 4 different articles up on the website today, but eventually, guys, you'll get to hear us talk to the actual apologists, the big top dogs, and you'll get to hear how they fare against the early church. And you're going to hear them openly condemn the early church and call them a bunch of idiots. And we would never say that about the early church. We can see that not only is the pre-Nicene church on our side, but even the post-Nicene church would condemn the Catholics and Orthodox on so many points. Anyway, Nolan, did you want to say anything? Because I'm just kind of hanging in here. It might be too late to have the big call on prayer.
I suppose so. We can probably do it maybe tomorrow night or Friday night. I'm fine with over anytime the next couple days.
You're going to have me
doing
go
it
3 nights in a row, aren't you?
Well, we can do it Friday night. How does that sound, Friday night?
That sounds good. That sounds good.
Well, I do get off at 8 o'clock on Saturday night. I don't know if that's too late.
Well, I don't know if these guys can handle it. But then again, I will have gone 3 nights.
Well, I'm fine with whenever you want to do it. But it is a bit late now.
Yeah, it is.
But this is also a very important subject to discuss because, it's one of the main things that the Catholics and the Orthodox will bring up. It's a much more fundamental point than anything else. You can get them to, you can point out something where they're in disagreement with the early church, but this is what they're ultimately always going to resort to, is that, well, they have the authority. What are you going to do? And so that's a major hurdle that has to be addressed and has to be confronted for everyone.
Yes.
So that they know for themselves.
And it's fair to ask, what are we supposed to do? if we don't have bishops, what are we supposed to do then? Can we offer the
Yeah.
Eucharist? Can we baptize? So we have to show the quotes on those subjects. We were just responding to an old message that Jake made. Yeah. Well, you guys want to hear Athanasius here? Did you guys know Athanasius repented of involving the emperor in condemning heretics? Judging within the church and exiling heretics like Arius? Because, of course, Constantine himself changed his mind. Did you guys know that? He became an Arian, and then he exiled Athanasius, and he unexiled Arius. And then Constantine, after Constantine died, his son became emperor, and his son Constantius ended up abusing the church. And Athanasius actually says that there were no legitimate bishops left anywhere, wherever Constantius was able to rule, which was the entire Roman Empire. He says all the bishops were gone all over the world. They were all deposed and replaced with fake bishops. This is something Athanasius himself says. And the deeper you go down this rabbit hole, guys, the more completely annihilated you realize the church was. It's so much worse than we could even say. The more you learn, the more destruction you'll find. And the Catholics and Orthodox cover this up. They just pretend, oh, the church was great. Sometimes they'll let it slip and they'll just casually mention, in the 300s, the church was in ruins. It was very hard to find a church that taught the truth, even just about something as simple as Christ's divinity. It was hard to find that, but it worked out later on over time. Well, no, they have to admit then that there were times when the church was invisible, according to them, and that there were no valid bishops. Here, let's read Athanasius. He's talking about Constantius interfering. He says, "For if a judgment had been passed by bishops, what concern has the emperor with it? Or if it was only a threat of the emperor, what need in that case was there of the so-named bishops? When was such a thing heard of before from the beginning of the world? When did a judgment of the church receive its validity from the emperor? Or rather, when was his decree ever recognized by the church? There have been many councils held up until now, and many judgments passed by the church, but the fathers never sought the consent of the emperor thereto, nor did the emperor busy himself with the affairs of the church. The Apostle Paul had friends among them of Caesar's household, and in his letter to the Philippians he sent salutations from them, but he never took them as his associates in ecclesiastical judgments, that means church affairs. Now, however, we have witnessed a novel spectacle, which is a discovery of the Arian heresy. Heretics have assembled together with the Emperor Constantius in order that he, alleging the authority of the bishops, may exercise his power against whomsoever he pleases, and while he persecutes, may avoid the name of persecutor, and that they, supported by the emperor's government, may conspire the ruin of whomsoever they will, and these are all such as are not as impious as themselves. One might look upon their proceedings as a comedy which they are performing on the stage, in which the pretended bishops are actors, and Constantius is the performer of their behests, who makes promises to them, as Herod did to the daughter of Herodias, and they, dancing before him, accomplish, through false accusations, the banishment and death of the true believers of the Lord." Well, that sounds pretty bad. This is Athanasius condemning an emperor having anything to do with the church. Even he shouldn't even be called a Christian. A bishop can't be, or an emperor can't be a Christian, let alone have authority over the highest authorities of the church. But he says, when was such a thing heard of before the beginning of the world? When did a judgment of the church receive its validity from the emperor? Or rather, when was his decree ever recognized by the church? You guys realize the Orthodox and Catholics teach that ecumenical councils could only be convened by an emperor, and that if you don't have an emperor, a council does not have the authority to be binding on the entire church. So they say the emperor actually is like his office is a church office. It's a necessary office to administer the decrees of the church, the dogmas. He's necessary to establish orthodoxy in the church. That's completely contrary to what Athanasius says here. And Athanasius is repenting, guys. He's realizing what a mess involving this emperor has caused. But he's not done. He continues. Yes, go ahead.
emperors couldn't be Christians, right? If they still stayed in that position.
No, you have to give up government office to become a Christian, to even become a catechumen. If you're in politics, you got to give it up. If you're a police officer, if you're in any kind of evil occupation, you have to give it up. You can't be a tax collector. You can't be a prostitute. You can't be somebody who fights in the gladiator games. You can't be an actor. As in
Luke,
somebody who entertains people on the stage.
does a lawyer count? Like if you're a lawyer?
No, you can't be involved in judging people. The only judges that we're allowed to be as Christians is being a judge within the church, as in a bishop or a presbyter, and we have to be elected to that.
What if you're on the defense side of like the lawyer role? Like you're representing a client who you don't think is guilty?
Well, that's a pretty horrible thing, don't you think? Saying that somebody is innocent who you know is guilty.
No, I meant like I
No,
think I mean
he's saying fighting for
So
the right person.
somebody, but it's a very small amount of clients, and even somebody that you think is like, I don't know if this person doesn't seem guilty. They probably could still be guilty. You never really know for sure.
It's not a
It's just
Christian.
best not to be involved in any of that.
Yes, it's not.
yeah.
It's not a Christian idea to just just defend somebody, even if he's guilty.
Yeah, isn't that one of the reasons why we can't pass judgment because we don't know for sure because we're not, what is it, omniscient? We're not
Yeah,
all knowing.
exactly. We're just like not that good at it, is the thing. We don't have all the facts. We don't know everybody's exact motivations, what they meant to do. It's like not only do we not know the outward facts, but and everybody accepts that. Everybody is like, yeah, we don't know the all the outward facts, but we also just don't even know like the inward thoughts of people. And God not only knows the outward facts that we don't know, but He also knows the inward thoughts of everybody, and He dispenses justice in a much more measured way than anybody else does. So it's best just to leave all that to Him.
Yeah, we can be very biased sometimes.
Yeah.
Seeing as we can't judge as well as God can, uh, is that a reason why? Could that be a reason why the death penalty shouldn't be a thing?
No, I think it should be a thing. I think the government should be wiping out people. The government is like neutered right now, essentially worthless almost. People back in the day, there used to be public executions. Early Christians talk about this. And they describe it. They say, we don't watch the public executions, but then they say, even though they're just, it's just what they're doing. They're wiping out these very wicked people. It's fulfilling a function in the world, keeping things relatively stable so that society doesn't
Wouldn't that
collapse.
contradict that you can't pass judgment though because you don't know
Right.
what's going on,
The person
but you
being
kill somebody?
the person being executed for their crime. Obviously, if we've confirmed that they've committed the crime, it's fitting and he deserves it. He should die. However, as Nolan also pointed out in the recent politics video, the one administering the judgment is not necessarily a righteous man himself. So, in that sense, an evil person is executing someone else when he himself deserves to be punished. So that part is unjust. Really, the judges that we would say are truly just in their judgments would be the bishops, who will, they're led by the Holy Spirit, and they'll assemble witnesses, and they'll always call forward reputable, righteous men to give their judgment, also to act as witnesses. They wouldn't accept testimony of people who had a bad reputation, some person who's evil. If that
Wait,
person
what was the
came,
last part?
Well, there's a huge list, Ray, that you could look up. You're exactly right. There's a huge, ever growing list every day, going back as far in recorded history as we can of this sort of thing, at least within the United States legal system, of people wrongfully being convicted. And many of these people not only did not actually commit the crime and they were locked up for a certain amount of time, but some of them were actually killed. They had the death penalty inflicted on them. And that just shows again that the government is not perfect at judging people. We've carried out vengeance on people. We've killed people even when they didn't even deserve it, when they were innocent. Yet, nevertheless, um, the government serves a purpose. I mean, Paul says it doesn't carry around a short sword for no reason. Um, we do. I'm not anti-death penalty. Is the thing. I'm not anti-government doing its thing. That's the purpose of the government. It's just Christians can't be involved in the government. It's like you can't say like, oh, I'm against Babylon. I'm against God saying that Babylon should go and destroy the Jews. It's like that's his will. He's decided it. The Jews have rejected God. You read the book of Judges. They
Yeah, but
turn to
that's
idols.
God though. That's God though. That's a little different.
No, it's the same. It's Babylon. It's wicked, pagan, evil, God-hating Babylon. But the point is that God has allowed them to carry out something against these people, and it's just. But these people are also going to be steamrolled afterwards, and that's
Um,
that's the thing about the government.
uh, uh, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't God use these evil people to pass judgment here on earth?
That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's the same case. So the government, if you want to think about it, the government is just a lot like it's like Babylon, right? Now Babylon was not just, it was not like pure, but it was carrying out a just thing, which was the chastisement of Israel because they had fallen into such wickedness and sin. Yet nevertheless the ones that were carrying it out weren't thereby justified. They were still steamrolled afterwards, and that's what's going to happen to all governments in the world. But they do carry out a function for the time being, that they create some semblance of peace in the world. And if we want peace in the world, yeah, it is probably in our best interest that these people get wiped out. Like the worst people that you could imagine, pedophiles that we know for a fact are absolutely like pedophiles with video recording. They're admitting it. They're like, yeah, this is what I do. And we're like, put them in a prison cell and give them 3 meals a day. No, cut their head off, publicly hang them. That's what a government does. That's the purpose of the government. I'm a pacifist and I'm saying this. I have to tell the government what it does. That's its function, that's its role. And if it doesn't do that, you see what we have today where people are crazy in the streets and they can just get away with anything. You don't want anarchy. Nobody wants anarchy.
Yeah, God is a harsh
That's the
judge. God's
he
not against
was.
What
judgment.
He was.
about First Corinthians 6, where it talks about that we should judge each other or settle disputes amongst ourselves?
That's not talking about killing somebody.
Yeah.
It's talking about putting somebody out
Yeah,
of the church.
exactly. Yes.
Okay. Well, I was just saying about judgment. I wasn't necessarily talking about killing people.
I don't know, bro.
Isn't that called a vessel of wrath?
I think you might be a little confused. Only God knows who are the vessels of wrath.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we look at people and we might think there's somebody that could be saved, but God knows their ultimate end. He knows that they'll never believe, no matter how much we labor over them. But we don't make that judgment. We don't say, that guy's a vessel of wrath. You don't know that until Judgment Day. That's a secret thing.
I was gonna say, aren't we like told by the early church to pray for the government?
Yes, absolutely. Just like Nolan was saying.
They paid for. Wait, what was the question again? I'm sorry.
He's saying
Oh, go ahead.
didn't God say that we should pray for the government? And I was saying yes, absolutely.
Oh yeah,
That's what we were saying.
yeah. I was talking about that in the video. Absolutely. Origin says that the king carries out a righteous war, even.
There are wicked groups on the earth that we can clearly see are evil, and we don't lament them being destroyed when they're very wicked. But God will sort them out. Even if anybody innocent does die, God will sort them out. Not that we would ever kill them ourselves. It's just we know God is just, and that even if somebody dies in this life, even if a Christian were to be executed we wouldn't go mourning over it. We'd say, this man will receive his rewards in the next life.
And when Paul talks about any participation that the Christians have in the carrying out of judgment, like when he speaks to the fact that we will judge the angels and whatnot, I mean, a lot of that is obviously that's going to take place after the resurrection, when we have a lot more knowledge than we have now, much more knowledge. What we have now is very imperfect. So yeah, I mean, it's not that judging is bad. That's really the key thing that everybody should take away. It's not that judging is bad, judging needs to be shunned. Oh, we don't like judging. It's just a fact of like recognizing that humans in our current state are not that good of judges. Now, we should be discerning in the sort of people that we you know, have relations with, the sort of people that we're around. It takes, yeah, we have to be discerning, and it's not like completely like no judging whatsoever. But it's really just as far as that, like who are we going to have fellowship with? And I think in the example that Paul gives in his letter, he's talking about like, people going to law over like settlement disputes and whatnot. He's like, what are you guys doing? Figure it out amongst yourselves. What are you getting the government involved for? What's wrong with you? You're supposed to be more wise than this, that you have to resort to pagans for advice. That's really his point there.
Here, let's read the next part of Athanasius, talking about having secular authorities involved in choosing bishops. Again, this is in the early, or we'll say early to mid 300s. He says, who indeed has not been injured by their calumnies, meaning their slanders? Whom have not these enemies of Christ conspired to destroy? Whom has Constantius, the emperor, failed to banish upon charges which they have brought against them? So he's saying, like, nobody, no righteous priest has survived this. They've all been either banished or some of them have even been killed by the emperor. He's saying, who has he not kicked out of the church? He says, where is there a church which now enjoys the privilege of worshiping Christ freely? If a church be a maintainer of true piety, it is in danger. If it dissemble, it abides in fear. Every place is full of hypocrisy and impiety, so far as he is concerned. And wherever there is a pious person and a lover of Christ, and there are many such everywhere, as were the prophets and the great Elijah, they hide themselves. If so be that they can find a faithful friend like Obadiah, and either they withdraw into caves and dens of the earth, or pass their lives in wandering about in the deserts. So he's saying Christians now cannot openly assemble. Only the heretics are openly assembling. Real Christians are withdrawing into caves and dens of the earth, or they pass their lives wandering in the deserts.
This is such an unnerving quote.
Yes. He's saying the church is in ruins, guys, in the 300s. He says, these men and their madness prefer such calumnies against them as Jezebel invented against Naboth, and the Jews against the Savior, while the emperor, who is the patron of the heresy and wishes to pervert the truth, as Ahab wished to change the vineyard into a garden of herbs, does whatever they desire him to do, for the suggestions he receives from them are agreeable to his own wishes. And he says about the bishops, he says, accordingly he, Constantius, banished, as I said before, the genuine bishops, because they would not profess impious doctrines to suit his own pleasure. And he says he sent this guy to go threaten all of them to obey his new decrees. He says after threatening them in this manner, he was not ashamed to declare publicly with a loud voice, the emperor disclaims Athanasius and has commanded that the churches be given over to the Arians, and to agree to receive as their bishop whomsoever the emperor should send them. And then Athanasius sarcastically says, of course, Constantius was strictly upholding the canon of the church when he caused this to be done, when instead of requiring letters from the church, he demanded them of the marketplace, and instead of the people, he asked them of the wardens of the temples. He was conscious that he was not sending a bishop to preside over Christians, but a certain intruder for those who subscribed to his terms. So you hear us use this term, guys, fake bishops, false ordinations. Athanasius is saying it right here. He's saying we've got a bunch of fake bishops, pretended bishops, he calls them. He says the pretended bishops are actors. in his book History of the Arian Controversy, chapter 52. This is what you'll uncover, guys, if you study the history of the church and what happened at Nicaea and after Nicaea. Total chaos, total destruction of the ordination of the bishops, total destruction of apostolic succession in less than 100 years, less than 50 years. This is what we've been telling you. And it was all prophesied to happen.
Luke, who exactly was the last truly ordained bishop?
Well, that's impossible to say, Ray, because we know that when the bishops who arrived at the Council of Nicaea were beginning to subscribe to Constantine, many of them, or all of them, were legitimately ordained, but now they were submitting to an emperor. So even though they were validly ordained, they were losing their authority by letting an emperor, a secular authority, dictate the doctrines of the church. So even their ordination didn't matter anymore. It's just after Nicaea, we know that the bishops abdicated their authority and relinquished it on a secular authority.
And that's right. And that's why some post people say some things right and wrong.
Right. Well, they have the writings of the early church, and they revere the early church very much. But when it comes to ordination of bishops, they completely ignore what the church said about that. Actually, here's what they say. When it comes to the issue of an emperor needing to give up his position in government in order to become a Christian, they ignore that part. And what they do is they take the quotes from the early church where they say secular authorities cannot, make judgments within the church. They'll take those quotes and they'll say, but the emperors are not secular authorities. They're Christian authorities. And they'll act like the office of emperor is an actually God-ordained office in the church, which is absurd. God only ordained bishops and presbyters and deacons. Those are the three offices. God never made the office of emperor in the church. But they'll say, yeah, he's a Christian. But guys, when the church says secular authorities don't have any authority over the church, like it says in the apostolic constitutions, it's not saying, as long as the emperor is a Christian, then he has authority. That's not what it's saying. It's saying you can't even be an emperor and be in the church. It's saying if you're an emperor, you are automatically a secular authority. Because an emperor can't even become a Christian. He can't even be a catechumen unless he gives up that position. So how could there possibly be such a thing as a Christian emperor? There's no such thing. Yes, David, you do have a messed up sleep schedule. Well, it's 10 o'clock. We could keep on going like this. We've gone for an hour and a half. We'll have another call on prayer sometime, guys.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Yes.
Is there like any what was it? I forgot.
Raheem, come up with your question first and then start speaking.
I have a question earlier.
Yes,
or
David.
Raheem, did you remember?
Are you asking Raheem to remember? That's not a good idea.
No. Okay, so my question about earlier was there was something you were reading where it was about the bishop binding and loosing.
Yes.
And it said the gates of Hades will not prevail against his binding and loosing. What does that mean?
Well, since we're bringing up the subject of gates and Hades, we had a big call on it, David, where we explained that the church understood the traditional plain meaning of what Christ said when he says the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church, is that his church, all of which will end up being dead people, dead Christians, the gates of Hades will not prevail against them. It will not remain closed over their souls, but that it will be opened and the souls will come out after Christ descends and breaks the bars, breaks the gates of Hades. However, Origen is the one and only teacher who, of course, he being extremely wise and having a very deep understanding of Scripture, he understands the more mystical meanings, and he recognizes that every heresy is, in a symbolic sense, an entrance into hell. And there are many different paths you can take, many different doors you can take to go to hell. So in that sense, he does, in his commentary on that verse, say that the more mystical interpretation is that the gates of Hades is also referring to different entrances, different ways to be damned. But he is still not denying the fact that you still have to be an obedient, truthful, Orthodox bishop in order to have any authority. He's not saying, oh, every bishop, we must obey bishops, no matter what, even if they're wicked, even if they're heretics. He never teaches that doctrine. And he certainly never teaches that the whole church will always remain in orthodoxy. I challenge anybody, if you want to take Origen's quote there, if they want to say, this proves our doctrine of the church always existing. Okay, well, give me Origen saying that specifically. All he says is just that in his mystical interpretation, which is true, there are many different paths to death, and that the truth always wins in the end. When he says that orthodoxy always wins and that all the heresies will never prevail against the one true orthodox interpretation, he is not at all saying that all the bishops will remain faithful. He never says anything like that.
I'm going to bed, Luke. Thank you. Good night.
You're welcome, Ray. Good night.
Does that make sense, though, David?
Yeah, I understood what the gates of Hades thing meant. I just didn't know
You
what
get
it
the
meant.
idea of like a gate
But
and like
I
a
get,
key, right?
yeah,
Like, because Jesus says, if you remember, he says in Revelation, the Apocalypse, he says, I possess the keys to Hades. And so why would he say I possess the keys? It's because he's the only person that's left Hades. He got through that gate. And so he says, I possess the keys and I control who gets in, who gets out. And that's up to me, is what he's saying. He says, I'm going to control when people get out. And so ultimately, the gate is not going to prevail over the church. We're not going to be stuck there, left there forever. And God will just forget about us, but we will escape the gates of Hades.
Yeah, it makes
through the
sense.
resurrection.
He's just talking about this one part where Origen says, and the gates of Hades ought not to prevail against him when he wishes to bind and loose. So he's talking about this part where Origen gives a very mystical interpretation of this part. Even then, it is not the doctrine that the Catholics and the Orthodox push, David. Not by any stretch. If you want to read it here, he talks about it. I mean, y'all already.
Yeah, Origen. The thing is about Origen's Matthew commentary is it's extremely valuable and extremely wise and extremely insightful, but it is not the standard, typical interpretation that you're going to be finding in this book,
It's
because
not the
that's not
simple
the
one.
reason that it was written. He was actually commissioned to write this. He had actually already written several other Matthew commentaries that I would assume are more simple and straightforward in their explanation of what's going on. However, those have unfortunately been lost to time. Only this one remains. And again, this one was commissioned for the sole purpose of interpreting the more mystical interpretation of everything in the text.
Oh, so this one is for the experts, the well-established Christians.
Exactly.
Yes, beginners should not read this book, but it is all true. When we say it's not the standard interpretation, we just mean this is not what they would just teach publicly to all the laity, because most laity are not able to understand these deeper things, at least unless if they have not been in the faith for a while.
When you say commission, did like the church specifically ask him to write it, or was it just his purpose to like give a deeper understanding? Like,
Yeah, no, I mean the church wasn't like a formal like committee or anything at that point that was like commissioning him, but it was a decent body of Christians that had actually funded the thing to be written. Yeah, like they gave him the money to, hire the scribes and get all of the paper and the ink and everything, the papyri. Because it wasn't cheap back then to write this stuff down, and they wanted multiple copies too. So they would have to fund this sort of thing whenever they wanted Origin to write something. So they did commission him to write this, to make this. Yeah,
it's pretty cool. Other people who were like commissioned to write or give commentaries about certain things.
Origen was the first big one, really. I mean, Origen was like the first expositor. He was the first one, as far as we know, that created several commentaries of each, you know, book in the scriptures. Previously, if you look at the rest of the church fathers before him, they're usually writing to people under specific circumstances. It's more of a letter or an apology. Um, some rare examples are like, you've got Justin Martyr, where he's got dialogue with Trypho. But again, that's not a commentary. That's just him recounting something that had happened recently in his life. Origen was like the first big one like that, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, this is the section where he says, every sin and every false doctrine is a gate of Hades.
Was Tertullian by far the most popular church father?
Oh, no.
No, I wouldn't say so. He was very popular though. Just like the most popular though, I don't think so.
Who do you think it was?
Origen. Origen, just because of how well traveled he was, how big of an influence he was. He was just a huge titan of a figure, like just a colossal figure in the church. And there's nobody else after him that like so many people like revered as passionately. Like you have people that are like truly like, I love Origin. Like you don't have this kind of like this obsession for anyone else. Like there's no like there was no one that was like Justin Martyr, you know what I mean? Like that's it was Origin, and Origin. I mean, didn't some people, Luke? Some people called him. He was like an apostle. They said they went as far as to say that.
Jerome said he was like that. Jerome said
Yeah,
so
Jerome.
much about him, but so did all the others. We must
Um,
release our video. Yes?
yeah. Um, I know the Orthodox interpretation of the gates of Hades won't um overcome the church, but it it by even by their interpretation, it still would come down to whether they think the church is a building or not. Because even if you say that, and they admit that the church isn't a building, it is true that the gate, like, by their interpretation, the church never fell. It the church never fell away, because you always have like a remnant of believers in every generation, even though it's not like a body,
Yeah,
basically.
Yes, the church
I know
never
what you're
died.
saying.
The church never died.
Yeah,
It's always been a remnant.
but they'll say it's dead if it's not like down the street. Is the thing. If it doesn't have a website in their like local community and like a local building that they can attend that's within like a 10-mile radius, then it's dead. Then the church has fallen away. That's their definition of falling away.
Hey, Luke.
I was meant to ask this a while ago, but why did Eusebius say that Origin castrated himself?
Because it was a rumor that was very popular, and he assumed it was true. But even Origen's biggest hater and biggest critic, Epiphanius, in his history, where he talks about Origen, even in a book where he accuses Origen of being a heretic, this is something he wrote in the late 300s, even he thinks that it was just a slander made up. He says he doesn't believe it's real. I don't.
I've never
Eusebius
believed it.
wasn't believing it out of malice or hatred of Origen. He's just saying this is something that was commonly said, and he says, if it's true, Origen probably just did it in his youth when he was teaching a lot of people in Alexandria, and he was concerned because he also had a lot of female students, and Epiphanius points out, this would be contradictory. That doesn't make any sense to say he was concerned because he had a lot of female students and he wanted to be above reproach. Because, if he had ever openly told anybody that he'd castrated himself, they would have said, you can't be a teacher anymore. And so if he had castrated himself in secret, well, how would that raise him above suspicion? Because how is it that you're protecting yourself from any suspicion of doing anything with the women? So you go castrate yourself, but then you don't even tell anybody you castrate yourself. So how's anybody even supposed to know and see you as being above suspicion? It doesn't make any sense. It's contradictory. If he had done such a thing, either he told everybody and then he would have been not accepted as a teacher anymore, or if he kept it a secret, how could anybody even know it?
Luke, who is that person that Irenaeus, I think, rebuked for asking the Romans to castrate him? Am I thinking about the right person?
Nothing comes to mind, John. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Do you know what he's talking about, Nolan?
I
I'll have
do
to
not.
look it up again. Maybe it wasn't Irenaeus that said that. But it wasn't Irenaeus that did it, but someone was basically trying to do that, and he asked Irenaeus about it.
Why wouldn't they have accepted Origen as a teacher anymore if he did that? Is that because that's very silly to do?
No, if anybody castrates himself, he can't be a teacher in the church. That's a teaching of the church. It's in apostolic constitutions.
Oh.
I'm pretty sure that would just be a sin in itself. That's just grave bodily harm.
JB asked if the souls that were raised from the dead in the Gospels and Acts, whether they left Hades. And of course the answer is yes.
Only temporarily, though, is the thing. So, you take, Lazarus, for example. Lazarus escaped Hades for only a time, but had to go back, of course, whenever he died again. Christ is the only one that has completely escaped Hades, where, he says, I'm not even going to go back there. I have the power to say, no, I'm not going back. Unless I want to, but I'm not forced to.
This is kind of beyond our knowledge, but has anyone said anything about, you see, if someone comes back from Hades, like Lazarus, did he remember what Hades was like?
I'm sure he did.
Okay.
Hey, Luke.
Yes. Was that Raheem?
Yo, Shizzle.
Oh, Isaiah.
Yeah. How's it going?
I'm doing well. Hope you are too. And I'll never call you Yo Chisel. You are Isaiah.
All right. So I had a question. So I'm pretty sure I heard you say this. It was in regards to the the canon of scripture, even though the early church didn't subscribe to the idea of a canon, but talking about Luke and Mark, how their books are regarded as scripture, but they weren't apostles, right?
Well, that's true, yes.
I always thought that they were apostles, because I thought just the 12 disciples, they were all of the apostles, and then Judas Iscariot was replaced with Matthias. So if Mark and Luke weren't apostles, then who were they? And then who were the other two apostles that made up the 12?
Well, those two, Mark and Luke, were other disciples. Luke was a disciple, or he was a companion of Paul, and he was even brought to faith by Paul, the completion of his understanding by Paul. And then Mark was also instructed by Peter. So Mark was with Peter, Luke was with Paul. And they wrote their testimonies, they wrote their gospels based on hearing witnesses explain what they saw.
Well, and some people said that Mark was one of the 70, right?
Hippolytus says that.
Yeah.
Although he does name a lot of Marks in there.
That's true. That's true.
In apostolic constitutions, Like Mark and was it? I think it was James or Luke. They were appointing bishops. So I wonder if like they'd be above that, like that role of a bishop.
Certainly.
Wait, so who were the 12 apostles then? Because I know Peter for sure and Paul.
Isaiah, you
Paul
gotta
was not
go.
one of the 12.
Isaiah, do you
Oh, so he's
do you know who Paul
yeah.
is?
No, I shouldn't have said he was one of the 12. No, he became an apostle later. Yeah, I know who Paul is. He used to persecute the church. Then he was on the way to, I think it was Samaria somewhere. Then it was like, Paul, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Or it was Saul at the time. Then he had scales on his eyes.
Okay, just
He
making
went to
sure.
someone's house.
Just making
Yeah,
sure. Is there
yeah.
anybody in here who doesn't know who Paul is and what his backstory is? Dante, I don't want to see you typing.
Yeah, it's my fault. I
He's
misspoke.
he's typing about something else. He has to be. Um, the word apostle has become kind of silly today. Paul is an apostle from God sent to the Gentiles, but he is not one of the 12. And you can be an apostle and not one of the 12. The word apostle is not a magical word that only can apply to 12 people who ever existed in all of human history. Jesus can even be called apostle in a sense because he is sent by God. And that's literally what the word means. If you've ever seen some of the older translations still render the letters as epistle, right? The epistle to the Corinthians or the epistle of Barnabas, the
Yeah.
first epistle of Clement. You notice epistle and apostle sound very similar. And that's because in Greek, the words have like basically almost the same meaning in the sense of just someone sending something. In the case of an epistle, it's a like a written message. I guess in the case of an apostle, it can also be a verbal message. But the point is, they basically both boil down to like the same idea. It's just sending somebody. Usually, in the case of sending them to deliver a message to people.
Interesting. So,
Here, I'll
huh.
give you the history of it right here, Isaiah. This is Eusebius talking about it. He says,
Yes.
Papias, who is a disciple of John the Apostle, he gives this history about the history of Mark. So again, this is Eusebius quoting Papias, and Papias is talking about his knowledge of how the gospel was written by Mark. Eusebius says, quoting Papias, this also the presbyter said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, that's talking about him being his interpreter at Alexandria in Egypt, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. But he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. And Eusebius says, these things are related by Papias concerning Mark. And then concerning Matthew, Papias says, so then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. So yes, Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew for the Jews.
But yeah, they used to call Mark's gospel Peter's gospel sometimes for that reason
Wait.
because
No, go ahead.
well, it's just because Peter was the teacher of Mark, so it followed thus, and likewise with Luke's gospel, you know, you could say in a sense it was Paul's gospel because ultimately Luke is getting a lot of his things from Paul and others, but
Yeah.
Luke is the one that wrote it.
Okay. That brings up another question. So I was like scrolling through the Ante-Nicene volumes. If you want to like look at the stream real quick, or you probably know what I'm talking about. But you just said Mark's gospel was also referred to as the Gospel of Peter because he was the disciple of Peter. Because I saw here in volume in volume 9. Wait, where is it? Right here it says the Gospel of Peter, and then I was like, wait, like isn't the
Yeah,
Gospel of Peter like a false book?
it is. Yes, they're not talking. The Gospel of Peter is if that's the same one that I
It's something
know,
completely separate.
it's something completely separate. It's a Gnostic piece of waste garbage, but no, that's a completely different thing. They're just calling. Sometimes it can be called. There can be like two names for two different, the same name for two different things, and it's like that here.
No, it's something completely different, Isaiah.
Oh, okay. Wait, so they have a false book within the set, or is this saying like Origin is doing a commentary on the false book?
I wouldn't
Isaiah,
even read this last
Isaiah,
volume.
Isaiah. The last volume in that in the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers set is a bunch of random books, which are not necessarily books that were read in church, but they're just a bunch of books that they have that they found, and they're books from that era, but not necessarily read by the churches. But they preserve them for us to read. Some of them are
Okay.
known heretical books.
Okay, so not all these are heretical, but some of these are.
Certainly. Well, they
Yeah.
have the two epistles. What do they have? The two epistles on virginity by Clement. Those are obviously legitimate. The commentaries of Origen are legitimate, but these are things that are more recently discovered.
Yeah.
And things that are not necessarily. I mean, they're like tiny little fragments, guys. A lot of the church fathers, we have tons and tons of manuscripts, but sometimes other things are found, and we just find one little manuscript, and so they ended up publishing it. But it's not necessarily something that was popular.
Yeah. All right. Well, when I
For
get to this, I'll
instance,
have to like.
for instance, Isaiah, Matthew's commentaries on, or I'm sorry, Origen's commentary on Matthew. I think we only have one manuscript of it, and it's very damaged. A lot of the time, the only reason why we have complete manuscripts of the Church Fathers is because they found multiple manuscripts, and they were damaged in various places, but they kind of combined them. They were able to fill in the blanks of whatever part was missing by using a second manuscript. So in that case, they put Origen's commentaries at the end, not because they doubt that it's written by Origen, but because the manuscript they found is incomplete. So it's kind of, it doesn't really deserve to be put alongside the other writings of Origen because it's just an incomplete manuscript.
Yeah.
You get it? Like the Matthew commentary, we only have a little bit of it that Origen made.
All right. Well, when I get to this in like however long, I'll also have to check back with y'all like which ones is good to read or not. But the other, from here on up, I don't have to worry about any of these being heretical, correct?
Right.
Yeah, you should not have
Right.
to. No, they should all be trustworthy. Just remember that once you get into the area of like the 300s, early
Yeah.
300s or late 200s, just be very cautious about that period because you've got like in the 300s, it's technically pre-Nicene, therefore it's before the Council of Nicaea, but it is still when the church got involved with the government. So, for instance, Lactantius was involved with Constantine. He was the instructor of Constantine's son. So that is pre-Nicaea, but it's Lactantius obviously is starting to do some things he shouldn't be doing. Shouldn't be involved with the government.
Mm, okay. All right. So you said be wary when it gets to early 300s and late 200s, even though it's technically pre-Nicaea.
Yep, start from the beginning and work your way up.
Got it. Yeah, I'm still I need to start reading the introductory notice to the what is it, Clement's epistle to the Corinthians, but like I can't say I haven't had time to read because you can make time, but then I've also been tired, so I don't want to like try to read it when I'm tired and not really retain the information or be reading over the same line like 10 times, but yeah.
Yes. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up the call and go to bed, guys.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Nobody had any more questions about what we were reading just a second ago?
I do have a question.
Yes, Dante.
So, for us to safely administer baptism or the Eucharist, we should have the discipline of a priest, right?
Yeah.
And would that be like the same thing as an elder or a bishop, or like,
Yes,
or
an
do
elder or a bishop.
okay? And like, what books go over that? I know apostolic Constitutions talks about it, but like, what other books?
Apostolic Constitutions gives a perfectly thorough explanation of the kind of lifestyle that a priest would have.
All right. Thanks.
Yep. It's talking about somebody who lives according to the highest standard of righteousness, which I don't think any of us have ever attained, but I pray we will. But we risk punishment if we offer the sacrifices or we baptize when we're unworthy to be doing that. A Catholic was trying to tell you that, JB? Here, let me show you something, JB. One second. Okay, here we are. Alright, here we go. This is the so-called Council of Trullo, sometimes goes by the name Quintisex Council. And this is a council that they had because the ecumenical council that they had just before that did not draw up a list of canons, so they had one more little council right after, just so that everybody was aware of what the canons were of the ecumenical council that they just had. So here are the two canons. He says, canon number 1, at this council, which the canons of which are ecumenical, meaning they cannot be contradicted. Both the Catholics and Orthodox consider this to be authoritative over the entire church. It says, now therefore we, by divine grace, at the beginning of our decrees, define that the faith set forth by the God-chosen apostles, who themselves had both seen and were ministers of the word, shall be preserved without any innovation, unchanged and inviolate. He says, for our decrees add nothing to the things previously defined, nor do they take away anything away, nor have we any such power. No power to change, to add, or to take away. That's what they say. So that's canon 1, kind of a funny canon. And then they say, canon number 2, it has also seemed good to this holy council that the 85 canons received and ratified by the holy and blessed fathers before us, and also handed down to us in the name of the holy and glorious apostles, should from this time forth remain firm and unshaken for the cure of souls and the healing of disorders. You know which 85 canons he's talking about, right? That's Apostolic Constitutions. So at their ecumenical council, they're saying these 85 canons are to remain firm and unshaken. And he says that these are handed down. They were received and ratified by the holy and blessed fathers before us. And this is Council of Trullo. I'll give you the year.
The audiobook, the audiobook that you have on the channel on Clement of Rome, the first epistle on virginity.
Yes.
Which book is that? Because I was looking in New Advent, and it said 2 epistles on virginity. So where's the first one? A second epistle, I mean.
We haven't uploaded it, Raheem, but you can go read it.
Wait, so
yes.
Wait, so it's just the first epistle. Then.
Yes, the first one is on our is on the YouTube channel, Raheem. You can go read the second one though. It's available online. It's not long. It's very short.
Oh.
JP, Apostolic Constitutions is it's found all around the world in various forms. Sometimes it's a little bit longer at some portions, other times it's shorter. but clearly the main bulk of it is extremely ancient. All the scholars believe that. We have writings from that book called Apostolic Constitutions, or we have versions of it that date to the 200s. So anybody who would claim they're from the 400s, they're crazy. Absolutely crazy. Some of the church fathers even quote from Apostolic Constitutions, pre-Nicene church fathers. So he's completely out of his mind. You got to be careful of these scholars because they'll refer to some, oh, we found some manuscript of Apostolic Constitutions that was changed or some little part was added. And they'll say, we think that the portion that was added, it was added after, the year 350, 370. But then it would be insane to say that the entire book originated from that time period. Obviously, it was just added to at that time period in the late 300s. But the book itself existed far longer before that. Just because people add to something over time doesn't mean the whole thing originated at the time that it was added on. But no, Catholics and Orthodox agree that all 85, or that the 85 canons are authoritative. The Catholics now, they've changed their minds. They say only the first 50, but you can see that their own council, this is one of the Catholics' favorite councils, this Council of Trello. It says all 85 canons are binding on the church.
Hey, Luke.
Yes.
So a quick question, because I know you're trying to leave, so you can just answer like in a yes or no. But I'm very sure that this was all covered in the baptism video, but I haven't watched it in a minute. But for forgiveness of sins, you would say that there is no forgiveness of sins besides through the means of baptism, and after that, no way unless through the means of the Eucharist, right?
I'll just say yes.
All right. I just want to make sure I'm not saying something false or misremembering nothing.
Yes. But it's up to God.
Yep.
He's given us the means to do these things. If God ever makes an exception, that's his business. We should just stick with what he's commanded.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, JB, you said it. Almsgiving is a way for us to wash away sins, but with almsgiving, we aren't told how much of it to do. God hasn't told us this amount of almsgiving equals this amount of, washing away of sin. So that kind of thing is up in the air. We know that even when a person was to receive the Eucharist, the bishop would tell him, go give alms, and then I'll give you the Eucharist. But the Eucharist was still that assurance that you would receive forgiveness of sins, not the almsgiving itself. It was just a requirement before receiving the Eucharist. But we know that almsgiving in itself gives a person favor in God's sight. And if we take the scriptures at face value, almsgiving itself can obtain forgiveness of sins for someone. But as a general rule, the church always said, give alms and fast and pray, and you'll be given the Eucharist.
So say someone got excommunicated and the church gave them penance, to do something, and that person did alms, even though they didn't do the penance that the church gave them, would not still count since the church has the power to bind and loose sins. If the church doesn't forgive it, would God still accept the alms?
Yes, God will accept the alms. But Raheem, you're talking about some scenario where you have a bad bishop?
No, just someone who got excommunicated.
But I'm sorry, I got confused, and I often do when you're asking questions. I'm not sure if it's me or you, but you were asking if a person does alms and he wants to receive forgiveness of sins, but the bishop still doesn't give him communion. What does he do? Or are his alms still accepted? Is that what you were asking?
Kind of, but let me explain again. In this scenario, a, a person got excommunicated because of something they did, say adultery or anything.
Yes.
And they get told to do penance. But before they could do that penance, the church hasn't forgiven them those sins, right?
Yes.
Um, but they gave alms. Would that alms still wash away their sins, even though the church hasn't, forgiven, loose those bonds? I mean,
I sure wouldn't count on it. No. If you were excommunicated from the church, it's a very different thing from a person who may have committed sins. He was never excommunicated, but he may have committed some sins and he went and did some penance for it out of the regret and grief he had in his heart that he wanted to show his repentance. But that person is not the same as somebody who's completely excommunicated, completely kicked out from the church. That person must have communion in order to be restored to the church. There are
oh,
degrees. There are degrees of sin, and there's degrees of being separated from God's grace. But Paul says you can come short of God's grace.
oh yeah, and I remember I think it's in the Bible where it said whatever you don't forgive, I won't forgive it as well.
Yes, that's true.
So if the bishop doesn't forgive that person, his alms wouldn't be effective to him. He has to finish the penance.
Well, the job of the priest is to make sure that a person is showing their repentance with actions so that they don't get judged more harshly for taking the Eucharist in an unworthy way. We're told to forgive people who've wronged us and to not hold grudges, but that's separate from the command given to the priest, because the priest isn't personally wronged by the person that was excommunicated, necessarily. The priest is barring him from communion for his own sake, so that he doesn't drink judgment to himself. So the priest is making sure that that man has truly shown his repentance, and then he gives him the Eucharist. And as for the question you're asking of whether he is still going to receive forgiveness if he did alms without receiving the Eucharist, Rahim, that would be left up to God in that situation if he's going to make an exception. But the rule of the church is that you're not in the church if you're excommunicated. You have to be communing with the rest of the church and be part of the body to be saved. But if you're excommunicated, I mean, you're saying, well, I hope I'm going to be saved, then you're an arm that was severed and put on ice, and you're hoping to still be part of the body even though you're severed.
It's a good analogy. Luke, I had another question. It's quick.
Yes.
Would would there happen to be a video and or um part on your website that talks about excommunication and then also you know, fellowship with unbelievers, but more specifically people who were brothers and sisters or at least claim to be and are living in sin and how to go about that?
You guys should not view anybody as a brother or sister who has a different version of the faith than you have. So don't see them as previous brothers and sisters. Now that you know what the faith is, now that you know what the ancient faith is, and you know that the church has defined it for you, then strive to be counted as one of them and to be part of their company, part of that body. You strive to be joined to that body as a member of it, and don't count anybody else to be a member of that body who doesn't consider themselves a member of that body, who has nothing to do with the church's teachings, but they're part of some heretical group. So pray for them and invite them to become part of that body. But don't call them a Christian. Consider them an unbeliever. Consider them a heretic, whether they are ignorant or just willingly and stubbornly persisting in their heresy. Either way, invite them to repentance and pray for them, but don't consider them a brother or sister.
Dang, always hitting me with the facts because I was just thinking, I was like, huh, because back then people were actually, they started off with the true faith and then um some of them persisted in their sin, but people who were never even from the true faith in the first place, even if it seems like they had a true heart for the Lord, if they had this information, they would change or it's out of ignorance, like they were never true brothers and sisters.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to like be ready with all the the verses and the quotes, or at least enough, so it's not just like I'm saying stuff and doing stuff, and it's not like I have stuff to back it up, even though I know it's the truth.
Yes. Well, there's a real church that you're either a part of or you're not, Isaiah. And I know in these last times it's really hard for us to establish that with somebody else. They look at us as being some kind of weird independent group. But when Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him in private. And if he doesn't listen to you, go tell the church. He's talking about the church. He's not saying, go to the nearest heretical sect and tell them about it. There was just one church to go and tell about it. And your
Luke, I have a
brother,
question.
if your brother or sister is not part of that church, then they're not accountable to the church. They're outside of the church, and you have to view them as somebody who's not even a brother. You would never even go to that person and bring witnesses from the church and be like, hey, you got to repent. You just say, oh, this person's completely outside of the church. I'm not even going to bother them. If they wrong me, I won't hold it against them. I'll pray for their conversion, their salvation, but I won't call them a brother or sister. I won't expect them to live like a Christian when they're outside of the church.
True, because I was like, I mean, well, this is one friend specifically. Um, he came out of Buddhism. He's Lao, and well, back then, before I knew about like all the early church stuff, I would have considered him a brother. But now knowing, you know, just by definition, he's not a brother. Um, but like I'm trying to put him onto the early church stuff, and it seems like he's busy or whatever. But I don't know if he really cares, because I feel like maybe he thinks if he looks into it and he finds out that it's a truth, then it's going to convict him of his sin and take him out of this lifestyle that is comfortable for him. But like one of the major things that I'm trying to preach to him, of course, just like the basic doctrines I want him to know. That's why I wanted to be in the Discord calls and all that. But about like one of the things, not shaving your beard, and then also just things because I haven't read it yet, but just the things talked about in Clement's epistle on virginity. Because like there's this one girl who yeah, it's an unlawful relationship. I don't think they're in fornication or nothing, but just normal worldly stuff that most Christians are proclaiming Christians will say is cool.
Yes, you should not consider them brothers.
I've
Yeah, so
just
I
been
guess
wondering, Luke, do you think people that are closer than others will still get more credit, even if they are in the end wrong?
I'm not the judge, John. I just know that I can't have fellowship with somebody who's not part of the church, who doesn't submit to that church.
But like, shouldn't we still say that, well, this person's better than this person, and give them more credit?
The better they are, the worse they are. That's how I see it. The closer somebody is to the truth, the worse it is if they persist in some heresy. God would rather they be hot or cold. He hates it when somebody is somewhere in the middle. So I absolutely cannot stand the Catholics or the Orthodox heresies because they are so much closer to the early church than the Protestants. They claim all the philosophies and they say, "Oh yeah, you got to go back to the beginning, man." And they're so deceitful because they don't believe in going back to the beginning. They just say it.
Is that why it's easier a lot of times for a completely evil person to turn away and become completely good than it is for someone who's kind of good to become actually good?
Yes, it's much worse to be in the faith and then fall away than to have never been part of it. And the Catholics and Orthodox are representing the early church to the whole world. They claim to be it. And of course, the world should know better and should be able to look at it and know that they're liars at face value, even if you had zero knowledge about the church or the scriptures. You should know that one of those groups are absolute, total liars just because of the fact that there are two of them. There are two groups claiming to be the original church, and they've excommunicated each other. Therefore, one of them has to be total, flat out liar, pants on fire. And they both speak with the same veracity and conviction. So it's possible for somebody to talk like that and be total liars. But surprise, surprise, it's not just one of them, both of them. The Catholics and the Orthodox are two harlots, both fighting over Christ, two thieves. They ridicule Christ in the middle. Christ is crucified between two thieves again, like Nolan said. Two harlots. They're going to get that baby cut in half.
So Luke, back to what I was saying earlier, real quick. So I'm thinking how I go about it is just pray for him, and then make sure I do my studying and my research on like the major things that I think he needs to know concerning the early church right away, and then talk to him about it, but like just give him a little first to see if he's even actually interested. Because if not, then it's just like wasting my time, casting my pearls to the swine, right?
Well, Isaiah, do you know how to find out if somebody's really interested? Do you know how to be really real in a conversation with somebody?
How to be really what?
Real, genuine, upfront.
Oh yeah, just tell him this is what it is. Your soul is on the line. Like I can show you all the proof and the evidence. You wouldn't say it like that, but
Yes, definitely don't say it like that. But you'd say, so and so, do you care about your soul? Do you want to live? Do you understand marriage? Do you realize what you're about to do? Do you even care about marriage? Are you going to marry that girl? Have you told her you're going to marry her? No? Why are you messing around with her? You're either marrying her or you're not. Why are you in a romantic relationship with somebody that you're not committed to marrying? And why are you committed to marrying somebody when you don't even know what marriage is? And when you're not even of the same faith, probably. And when you don't even know what Christianity is, let alone what marriage is, let alone what raising children entails. And you be real with him. You tell him to slow down, pump the brakes, and stop jumping into marriage until he knows what Christianity is. That's the most pressing issue.
all right. Well,
Luke,
that sounds like an amazing outline. I'm gonna have to I'll have to find the time to talk to him about it because I want to make sure that I'm careful. Of course, not sugarcoating, beating around the bush, like nothing like that. But just saying things in a way to where, if I can, avoid making him feel some type of way for the sake of not trying to push him away from the faith. But if I said the truth and toes get stepped on, then toes get stepped on.
Yes, it's true, Isaiah. Well, I don't want you to push him away, and I don't want to push somebody away. But I've also reached a point in my life, you know what happens eventually with anybody who's in this kind of field, where they might sound a little bit callous on the exterior, but they're not really callous. They're just trying to save time. Because you can't waste time with people. You can't sit there and tolerate all the foolishness and debate with them all the time. You just got to throw out that line, see if they bite, and if they don't, you got to just move on and be efficient.
Crazy.
It's not callousness. It's not a lack of love or feeling, because you're just going to love that person to death if they convert, if they change their mind. And I love all of you guys to death. But I've realized I take time away from important studies, or I take time away from somebody who does deserve that time, that labor. When you just sit there and endure somebody being so stubborn and resisting all the truth that you've given them, all the simple facts, we don't have to endure that. All right, big bedtime, guys. Look at the time.
wait, Luke, before you go, can I ask something?
Yes.
What would you say about people who they always claim they prayed for something and they came true? And I've seen people where it really does seem like some health condition where I can't explain that how they got healed from that condition, but they aren't, it doesn't seem like they're in the true faith. Like they do claim to believe, but they're not. Why would God answer that for them? Do you really think he's not answering them and
No,
it's some
it's
coincidence?
possible that God heals them. God is very merciful. I remember I prayed for things while I was still in sin, and God would answer my prayers. But we know
So
there
you
are
don't think it's just not real?
well, we know there are degrees. No, I wouldn't say it's just not real. I know that people are healed through prayer. I was healed through prayer as a baby. It's possible for God to heal people, and I'm sure He's always willing to. It's just that the person themselves, if they're unfaithful, God won't answer a prayer if they don't even have faith, and especially if they're
These
wicked.
are like heretics, though. Why would he answer it for a heretic?
Well,
I
there are
mean,
degrees of evil. When the scriptures say that God doesn't answer the prayers of wicked people, He's talking about really wicked people.
wait. Would you say it's has something to do with ignorance because when I was overcoming lust, you know I'll tell you the story real quick. You know I I did everything that I could to, to stop it, but I couldn't. I'd go a week, then I'd fall, and then so I went to God and prayed earnestly, and overnight He took it away from me. Now, even though back then I believed the law of Moses, but I was ignorant to all of these things. So maybe He saw the zeal that I had and helped me out regardless.
I think so, Raheem. He's done that for me too. I know that my dad, or my heavenly dad, blessed my earthly dad with many, many gifts, many blessings, even though my dad had a lot of problems, has a lot of problems. So I see that in God, that He has a lot of mercy and patience, and that God is looking for extraordinary people. He's looking for people who stand out, who aren't total degenerates. And God works on that person and is merciful and pours out gifts and blessings on that person. God doesn't put
Do you think he
everybody.
does that to strengthen their faith and say, I've given you
Yes,
something
He's
that you
drawing
can't
them.
claim? I've never given you
He's
nothing.
drawing them, John. Just like when it says that, when Jesus says that God draws people, it's not just this mystical, invisible thing necessarily where God's pulling them invisibly, but God causes things to happen in your life that tell you that He's there. And that would be a prayer answered here or there, or just some message that you receive that
I've
convicts you.
definitely felt like that. Yeah.
Yes. So God does that for people. God doesn't put all people into two categories, just total degenerate and then perfect saint. God doesn't see people like that. He sees a lot of people in between, and He draws those people. Any more questions, anybody?
Um,
Nah, you can go to bed.
All right, I've been
yeah.
sent to bed. Well, good night,
You have
everybody.
to go.
Yes,
Good
I
night.
think I better. Good night, everybody. God be with you. God bless you.
Good night.
God bless.
Farewell. See ya.